Well, I was going to say a very warm welcome, but that's perhaps not the most advisable phrase. But this event certainly is hot because it's attracted an enormous amount of registrations. I'm going to say, first of all, to the people here in the room, bravo, thank you so much. I've already met somebody who's come from the Isle of Wight and somebody who's come from Manchester. This is incredible. We really appreciate it. And to everybody online, although I can't at the moment see you, also incredibly grateful, where no doubt wherever you are, it's hot. Having said that, we do tend to get a wide international audience as well. I'm going to pause a moment because it looks like we've got some kind of technical matter to attend to. But what I will do is I'm hoping that two of our speakers, Manon and Stephanie, can hear me. And what I'd like to do is introduce you both, I think, because you're speaking online. And if I think you just go one after the other, that will probably work well. So first and foremost, then, so happy to welcome Manon Jones, who's Director of Research at the School of Psychology at Bangor University in Wales in the UK. I'm so happy to be working with Manon on the Calon project, and we've got a long way to go on that, and that's fantastic. I'd also like to really warmly welcome Stephanie Otaiba, whose work I came across, particularly there was one systematic review and meta-analysis that I really got interested in some time ago now. Stephanie's Professor of Teaching and Learning at Simmons School of Education and Human Development at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, USA. So can I invite Manon to do her talk, followed straight on by Stephanie, and after that we hope that Ellen Broomé will have arrived. So Manon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dom. I just need to be able to share my screen, I think. Can't see or hear anything, so I'm going to crack on, assuming all is well. So thank you for joining this session. It's unseasonable heat in the UK. Well, it's probably seasonable actually, but we're not used to it, let's say. I'm Manon Jones, and my work focuses on reading acquisition and bilingual reading. I'm a professor in psychology at Bangor University, and I also live in a bilingual Welsh-English part of the country. So much of my work takes advantage of this demographic, but of course, I'm interested in how children acquire literacy in many language combinations across the world. So in this talk, I'll first discuss literacy universals because despite being superficially varied, the process of reading acquisition is surprisingly similar across alphabetic languages. I'll then describe two cases of bilingual reading, the first in which children are ostensibly bilingual, but they have strong oral home language and they are learning to read in their much weaker school language. And the second case is children learning to read in two languages when they are also fluent in both. So in practice, of course, there are many permutations of these scenarios because bilingualism is a very tricky thing to measure in many ways because there are continua of bilingualism and language proficiency. But I've opted for these fairly extreme positions to highlight the challenges and interesting aspects of both as I see them. I'll end this short talk by speaking of Calon Cymru, which Dom alluded to, our sort of collaborative venture, which is a new national centre for literacy in Wales funded by the Welsh Government. Right. So as a starting point, let's look briefly at the reading rope. You're probably familiar with this already, and it represents an intuitive way of looking at the important components of children's reading acquisition. The rope shows how language comprehension skills combine with word reading and code skills, eventually leading to skilled reading defined by fluency and good reading comprehension. So, of course, word recognition skills are typically taught through methods such as phonics programs, whereas language comprehension arises from explicit instruction of vocabulary, morphology, narrative tasks, and so on. What's crucial to note here is that successful reading comprehension involves both decoding skills and language skills in combination as they sort of pleat together, I believe is the English expression, over a time and practice. So as I mentioned, this is the case in all languages, not just English. However, languages will differ depending on what the area of complexity is in a given language. So the important thing isn't that different languages require different skills. That's not the case. They don't. The same two ingredients are always there, decoding and oral language. What changes is their relative weighting. So in English, as we know, decoding remains a bottleneck for longer because of its inconsistent spelling. In a more transparent system, which is the case for most Indo-European languages actually, decoding is acquired more rapidly, and then oral language may become relatively more important for comprehension if it's complex in terms of agglutinative characteristics and so on. Okay, so different languages have different challenges, but also bilinguals speaking those languages will have different levels of proficiency. So we are dealing with a complex topic here. In these scenarios I'm going to outline, the first case is a case in which children are learning in a language that's not the one they speak at home, and indeed their oral language skills in the language of instruction is therefore relatively weak compared to some of their peers. In the second scenario, we have a child who is bilingual and has a certain level of proficiency in the two languages. They may hear it in their kind of environment, they may speak it with both languages at home, who is then learning to read in both of those languages. And then the interesting aspect there is how do those two reading systems interact and possibly even confuse the child as the child acquires both. Okay, so turning first then to the case of so-called bilingual monoliteracy, or in other words, when the home language is not equal to the reading language, the language of the schooling. In this case, the child might have adequate decoding skills, but language skills such as a rich vocabulary and so on are not well developed in the language of instruction. So this is important because good reading comprehension, as we know, is the product of both skills, as we've seen. And in some of my recent work, my team and I tested the relationship between code skills, oral language, and reading comprehension. So in other words, an empirical test of the simple view of reading. And so if oral language is so important to comprehension, what can happen when oral language is compromised? That's the challenge here. So in a number of cases, the child can look as though their reading ability is compromised. And in some cases, assumptions are made that the child has a developmental language disorder or dyslexia. So in fact, the child may be able to decode perfectly well, but poor fluency or comprehension is in some cases the result of limited language exposure in the school language and or interrupted opportunities, which can happen when a child attends school infrequently or indeed moves to different schools. So in other words, it's difficult to know whether a child's difficulty truly reflects neurodevelopmental disorder, or is it an environmental factor that relates to them not being able to acquire their language skills quickly enough to stay on par with their peers in terms of their literacy skills? So this can often be a delay rather than a long-lasting issue, whilst the child learns the language skills that they need in the school language, but it, of course, needs identifying so that they don't get misdiagnosed or fall too far behind their peers to be able to catch up adequately. So we know from decades of research that bilingualism itself should never be mistaken for a disorder. Genesee has been particularly influential in arguing that we must distinguish language difference from language impairment. But this is often easier said than done because children who are learning a second language can sometimes look remarkably similar to children with a developmental language disorder, especially in the early acquisition phases. Paradis has shown that reduced vocabulary and grammar difficulties in the school language may simply reflect the normal process of second language learning rather than underlying impairments. And the problem is compounded when we assess bilingual children using monolingual expectations, as has been the case until quite recently, actually. So language proficiency takes a long time to develop in a second language, often many years. And of course, we're dealing with fairly academic language, especially as the child progresses through school. So low attainment in the language of schooling should not automatically trigger assumptions about disorder. We need to be able to understand how the child fares in terms of their vocabulary, grammar, and their coding skills, basically in both of their languages whenever possible. And we also need to assess the child's educational opportunities that they've had, the exposure they've had, attendance, and the quality of instruction. So in other words, a fairly holistic view of the child's language and literacy abilities in order to make as accurate a judgment as possible as to their reading ability. So the key message from this first scenario is that we need to interpret reading performance through the child's language experiences. A poor outcome in the language of schooling doesn't necessarily indicate dyslexia or DLD. We need comprehensive assessment that considers language abilities across languages alongside educational opportunity and exposure. So now moving to the second scenario, bilingual children learning to read in both of their languages. In this scenario, we assume that usually the child has some spoken knowledge of both languages, either at home or in the environment, and that they therefore have two simultaneous reading systems developing somewhat sequentially, but at some point in parallel when they're explicitly taught to read in both of those languages, as is the case in Wales. So at this point, we can ask how learning to read in two languages affects literacy acquisition overall. So does literacy skill in one language transfer somewhat to the other language? Or does it actually lead to some more confusion in as they try to acquire the second set of literacy skills? So before we grapple with this rather complex question, it's important to note and look at the areas of overlap and difference in two languages as we try to learn to read them. The more global reading skills will include things like phonological awareness, alphabetic principles, decoding strategies, and so on, that you would hypothesize would map across languages since they're sort of fairly generic skills. The more sort of language-specific areas would be specific types of phonics, grapheme-phoneme correspondences, for example, vocabulary, specific syntax, and of course, reading comprehension being the product of oral language and decoding will be somewhat affected by given oral language skills in one language. So our study that I'm about to outline examined whether some literacy skills transferred from one language to another whilst others did not. So we can cluster the overlapping skills here into the domain of certain aspects of word reading skill, not all but some, and we can hypothesize vocabulary as a language-specific skill to a large extent under this framework as well. So we asked these questions in the study. Does a structured Welsh literacy intervention improve Welsh word reading per se? So that's sort of just a very applied question. And then in terms of theoretical and applied interest, do improvements in Welsh decoding transfer to a degree to English decoding skills as well? In other words, if you give them an intervention in Welsh, is there something they get for free in their other language, English? And also we asked, does home language matter? So we used vocabulary as a proxy for oral language here and looked at whether it was a good mediator of these other two questions and ensuing effects. So we conducted a randomized controlled trial involving just over 250 children learning to read in both Welsh and English. And we gave children a Welsh medium reading intervention. And the main questions I said is to see whether it improved Welsh reading, but also whether it had incidental effects on English reading. So children completed baseline assessments and were then randomly assigned either to receive 20 hours of literacy intervention delivered over 15 weeks or to a waitlist control group. We assessed outcomes immediately afterwards and again 9 weeks later. And we also examined whether effects differed for children who did and did not speak Welsh at home. So the children who did not speak Welsh at home would probably have had some environmental Welsh, but it wasn't strong. This design allowed us to investigate not only whether the intervention was effective, but also whether literacy gains could transfer across Welsh and English. So if we look at the effects of the intervention on word reading in Welsh, this Welsh literacy intervention had significant and sustained effects over time, which was encouraging. And then if we look at whether those effects transferred to the other language, English, we found that yes, they did, but only temporarily. So within 9 weeks of the intervention, any of the early sort of ephemeral effects had in fact disappeared. So what's interesting here is that these effects were similar, irrespective of whether the child spoke Welsh at home or English, or indeed any other language at home. So very striking effects there in terms of word recognition. But for vocabulary, we obtained differential effects. So the intervention led to growth in Welsh vocabulary skills in general. And children who did not speak Welsh at home received a sustained benefit from receiving these oral language skills in their second language, which was interesting, whereas the effects sort of trailed off in the native Welsh-speaking children. This is an interesting disparity in skills, we think, coming back to my original slide, in which language background appears to be less immediately important for word decoding skills and word recognition than it is for oral language. Oops. So bilingual literacy isn't simply two independent systems developing side by side. Some underlying literacy processes can transfer between languages, whereas language knowledge itself remains much more language specific. So this distinction is important because it tells us what we can reasonably expect interventions to achieve when we teach reading in two languages. Moving on now to potential sources of literacy interference. For bilingual children, two orthographic systems can cooperate, but they can also actually compete under certain circumstances. So in two alphabetic orthographies, for example, the same phoneme can map to different graphemes across languages. And a key signature of this is what we call orthographic borrowings, where you use a non-target phoneme grapheme mapping when spelling in the wrong language, basically. So if you look at this example here, the sort of classic phonological errors, if you like, in English are circled in red. So here with an erroneous e at the end, and so on, and what spelled W-O-T. But the ones in green are ones where the child has misapplied their knowledge of Welsh GPCs and used them in the case of English, probably indicating that Welsh is a bit stronger at that point than English. So we looked at how bilingual borrowings relate to longer-term spelling accuracy in these bilingual children. And to do this, we gave Welsh-English bilingual children who were between 7 and 10 years old an English spelling to dictation task in which they had to spell the word at the end of a sentence. So we had words like mass, kettle, and so on, quite irregular spellings in English. And we had a lead sentence, and they had to spell the last word. We then quantified their errors according to whether they were regular phonological errors or whether they showed signs of Welsh phonological sensitivity, so borrowings from the other language. And what we found was interesting in how early phonological sensitivity leads to spelling accuracy a few months later. So we showed in these bilingual children that sensitivity to English spelling patterns, in other words, English spelling errors, predicted better later English spelling outcomes. In other words, they're kind of, they're good spellings. On the other hand, reliance on Welsh spelling patterns, so these borrowings, predicted poorer English spelling outcomes. So our findings taken together suggest that successful bilingual spelling isn't simply about activating both languages all the time. Children also need to be able to effectively inhibit and be selective about when they apply certain rules from the other language and when it's inappropriate to do so. So the final message is that bilingualism is neither entirely beneficial nor entirely problematic when it comes to the case of learning to read in two languages. Two literacy systems can cooperate, but they can also interfere with one another under some circumstances. So effective teaching really needs to make those relationships visible to children. So I'd end this short talk by saying that bilingual reading instruction is most effective when it strengthens core literacy foundations and explicitly highlights where languages converge and diverge. And that can then support the transfer elements, which is obviously a benefit to bilingualism, whilst minimizing any cross-linguistic interference that might be occurring at the same time. So if we know this, how do we implement it across an entire education system, I hear you ask? Well, the challenge now isn't discovering what works. In many cases, we haven't answered all the research questions, of course, but we know enough to be able to try to implement some of this coherently across an entire bilingual education system. So this is what our Calon Cymru Centre is attempting to do in Wales, where in many schools, children are taught to read in both Welsh and English. So the challenge then is to educate the workforce in bilingual literacy and provide programmes and assessments through the child's educational journey to ensure that they become competent readers in both of their languages. Thank you very much.
I said I wouldn't say anything, Manon, but I really know what it's like when you're online and you can only see a certain amount. I just wanted to say thank you so much. Really insightful, fabulous research, fabulous implications. Really appreciate that. But we will as well move on to Stephanie, I'm hoping is ready to go.
There we go. Not muted anymore. Manon, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to you from the perspective also of being a researcher. I'm not going to be talking about bilingual work, although I've done work with bilingual children. And I'm also a former special educator. So today I'm going to be talking about reducing risk. And my intent is to provide some encouraging examples, not to survey the whole research, but beginning with data that indicates why it's important to reduce risk. And we know that consequences of poor reading can have really long-term effects that mitigate individuals' abilities to interact in their community, to be successful. In addition to straight-up academics, we have long-term effects that can undermine students in the workforce. So thinking about your roles, Dominic and Gossam were kind enough to let me know a little bit about the survey of the audience. So I believe about a third of you are teachers or administrators, about a third are special educators. We've got some researchers and graduate students and some people with other interests. But I think we still share a role in trying to reduce reading risk through early literacy intervention. So first and foremost, I think a lesson I try to share with my teacher candidates is we don't know everything every day that we show up into a classroom, but we've got to work on being kind and compassionate with ourselves as educators, as advocates, because we're doing the best that we can, and science is changing. So we want to engage in continuing learning about the science of reading, about what evidence is, about what things really are shown not to work. We need to clean out the fridge sometimes and not hold on to practices that are not effective. We can learn a lot from our communities. We can share the research that we're learning about through our own social media or through word of mouth, through interacting with other teachers and families, and then helping evaluate how an evidence-based practice might work in your own school and community. So the purpose of today's presentation was listed in your conference guide. But again, I just want to focus briefly on some encouraging examples of things that work, provide an example. I'm also very interested in how children respond to intervention and how that feeds into our understanding of how to use that data to support their ongoing learning. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about a program, a class-wide read aloud program that we've made free. So the resources will be in a separate slide deck to be shared with you after the conference. As a little bit of orientation, I'm going to talk about, in this first study, about response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support. And in these systems, sometimes they're called a pyramid, and ideally, the foundation is a strong evidence-based core reading program that includes multiple components, the components of code-focused and meaning-focused instruction that's evidence-based. And then for those students who still struggle, despite having received a strong core, ideally, they would receive more small group instruction that's closely aligned not only in content, but also in some of the strategies that teachers are using with their students. Sometimes these tiered interventions are provided by classroom teachers, sometimes tutors or specialists. And then the intent is that this would leave a relatively small number of students with relatively fewer resources needed at a school level to provide highly intensive data-based interventions that can be more and more tailored based on students' response. In many of the schools where I work, this pyramid doesn't look the same way percentage-wise. And we were very interested, a team of my colleagues working on a learning disabilities research grant, we were very interested to kind of turn this on its head and better understand what if we were able to screen students and provide those who needed the most intensive intervention right away. And we were fortunate to also be able to do a randomized control trial where we assigned some students to go through the typical RTI process, and other students were assigned to a more dynamic model that was a little more proactive and provided them intervention right away. So our participants in these schools, we had about 521 students in first grade. So that would be roughly 6 years of age. We did have very few bilingual or emerging bilingual students, just for note, and we had more than half of our students were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We wanted to have very efficient, fast screeners. So our most important go-to was teachers' judgment about how much risk the students had already demonstrated at the start of the first grade year. The severity that they judge students' reading skills across the multiple components within Scarborough's reading rope. We also did brief assessments. We assessed how many letter sounds students could name in a minute. The Fuchs's sight word fluency is really just a list of 50 sight words that are first grade words randomly taken from a Dolch word list. And so the students read as many words as they can in a minute. The test of word reading efficiency has two brief subtests. One includes sight words, and it's not just first grade sight words, and then nonsense words. So, as I mentioned, we randomly assigned students within classrooms to either receiving typical tier 1 or moving into our more dynamic system. So all students in the typical system began in tier 1, whereas in the dynamic system or model, students were assigned immediately to tier 2 or tier 3. Tier 3 was assigned if students were at the greatest risk within their schools and their teachers were very concerned. And tier 2 was created using a group of students that had risk in either category. And we continued to screen students. So I'm appreciative that you've already explained the simple view of reading, and Scarborough's rope, excuse me. That helps me set up what type of intervention we provided to the children. So we trained classroom teachers to provide an evidence-based core program that's very consistent with the science of reading. And I was working in the state of Florida, and in the school district where we worked, this core was required to be a 90-minute reading block. For tier 2 and tier 3, our team of interventionists pulled small groups of students, and we used some of the intervention materials to preview and review from the core. And we also were working through the Florida Center for Reading Research. And in my resources, I'll provide you free links to all of the activities that support code and meaning-focused activities. These were small groups. And then for students who screened in at the greatest need, we provided a standardized reading program that was also very consistent with direct instruction and with what was happening. So that was our code-focused aspect. We didn't assume in the meaning focus that children could read from the beginning. So we began in the first 8 weeks, whether it was tier 2 or tier 3, of teacher read read-alouds. We moved into a repeated reading kind of a situation where we had decodable readers from the core. And then finally, we incorporated some aspects of brief writing so that children not only did the repeated reading, but they used, we rewrote readers that were decodable and helped children understand text structure and help them to do a written response and retell. So I'm going to ask you to focus over here on this busy slide for a minute. The big picture is that we were able to get 95% of those 520 students reading at a fairly healthy cut point for basic reading. And we had an effect size, even though we randomly assigned children within the same classroom. So they had the same classroom teacher. They just differed as to when they started receiving tier 2 and tier 3. Children who were within the dynamic program actually had much stronger outcomes on basic reading scores in the spring, controlling for where they started in the fall, almost a third of a standard deviation. So that's a meaningful difference. I say we were happy because 95% of children were able to read on grade level, but we were worried about those who didn't respond, who showed less response. So that 5% of students that didn't achieve a cut point of a standard score of 91 or the 25th percentile was fairly low for basic reading, but for passage comprehension or for some of those fluency measures, we had higher proportions of students that were still struggling. So with one of my doctoral students, we were very interested in unpacking a little bit more about these children who showed minimal response. We were able to look back at videos that we had taken with permission from children and families and teachers of our interventionists working with children in these small groups so that we could begin to code what were some of the aspects that we could compare and contrast with children who were responding well and children who showed more minimal response. And we found that children that were minimally responsive had less engagement, less motivation, more anxiety about making mistakes, a lot more negative self-talk. And they seemed to feel like other people just got reading. It was like magic and it wasn't happening for them. So the overall takeaway, I think, is it's very important to provide early intervention as early as our schools are resourced. And there's going to be a need for some children to receive ongoing intervention, even when we've got a good system that's working pretty well. And some of those supports might need to be not only in reading. I should mention that our interventionists were also trained to provide some positive behavior supports for children. So that led us to provide a strong rationale for even earlier intervention. And we received funding to train kindergarten and early childhood teachers to provide a class-wide dialogic reading much earlier. And we went through a cycle where we initially did design. That was actually happening part of the time during COVID when schools were shut. Thank goodness for online work that we can do together. We conducted a researcher implemented pilot and a couple of rounds of teacher implementation to see how feasible it was for the classroom teachers. So our notion, our rationale was that it would be important to support these social and emotional learning concepts and to develop children's vocabulary to help them be able to see themselves as being successful and attributing it being okay to make mistakes, and that was part of learning. We also wanted to be sure that we had commercially available books that would be available in most school libraries, public libraries, or available for also for parents to be able to listen to with their children that had diverse characters. We created very, very scripted lesson plans for each unit. We gave teachers a whole manualized binder that included vocabulary cards, lesson plans, post-it notes to put the questions inside of each children's book. And then we trained them carefully to implement dialogic reading, to really interact with the children, to really build that listening and vocabulary and understand a little bit more about helping the teachers connect to students' background knowledge from a position of strength rather than a deficit, and to continue to ask slightly more difficult questions, carefully scaffolding children through the week. So this is just our scope and sequence. We ended up designing 5 different units. These were the main topics, and you can see below the types of words that we selected. We had a huge consulting team work with us, so we were really grateful to have suggestions from folks that were in communication sciences, behavior, other reading, and multicultural education. So all of these units and books and lessons will be available free for you at the end of the conference. So that kind of brings me towards the end of my brief talk today, is to just give you a foreshadow that the resources that you have were based on some of the roles I imagined you might be having within your school settings.
Amazing.
Dominic, thank you.
Thank you so much. Some really interesting overlaps between what Manon was saying with your talk, but you've taken us forward some steps, and I'm looking forward to when we get to talk as well. I think we'll be presenting some similar things, but some quite different things. I'm really delighted that Ellen has made it despite the weather trying to stop her trains getting to us, and you're still on time. So so you're here in person. Do come up now, and I will do the formal bit just to say that Ellen Broomé is the Chief Executive of the British Dyslexia Association. We've arranged this event in partnership. Little did we know when we arranged it that the weather was going to be like this. So I think you'll, if you stand here and use this mic, we'll look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Is that right?
Amazing. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Is that the camera? Am I looking at the camera now? That's the camera. Okay, that's the right place to be looking. And hi. So I'm Ellen. Okay, carry on. And I want to talk a little bit about when reading's a barrier and how we rethink support for dyslexic children. So today's session is really bringing together some research evidence, our experiences of thousands of dyslexic people that we meet and talk to every year, and the families that we support. So our vision, a little bit about us, because we've just published our strategy. So that's why I'm really excited about our new vision and mission, but a little bit about what we want to do. So we want to unlock the full potential of dyslexic people, and I'll come on to how I think we're probably not doing that so well at the moment, and our mission, and also what we think we're going to do, equipping the right, supporting individuals and families, building professional expertise, changing systems, and improving public understanding. And I just wanted to start with a quote here, which is that they think they know what dyslexia is, and they don't. And I think that's the main takeaway that I've had from talking to dyslexic people over the last 2 years since I joined the BDA. And dyslexic people are like, oh, is that reading thing? It's a bit difficult with spelling. And yes, it is, and can be those things. But I think, so people really recognize the word dyslexia, but I don't think they really understand what it means or the impact that can have on people. And I think that gap between awareness of it and understanding is where a lot of the barriers that dyslexic people face really come from. So why does reading matter? And I should declare an interest. I'm a trustee of Book Trust, and I love reading, and I'm an absolute stickler for grammar and punctuation and spelling. So what I'm doing in this job is certainly unclear to me, but I love it. So, but why does it really matter? Reading is one of the most important skills that children and young people can develop because it underpins learning in every single aspect of the curriculum. Success in reading opens the door to academic achievement, participation in school life, and obviously future opportunities as we go on. And I think also one of the things is that we sometimes, when I talk to teachers and parents and others, there's a sort of mismatch. They say reading when they mean decoding words. And I don't think that's what we really need. And we need to try and kind of maybe remove ourselves a little bit from that, because obviously it's being fluent. It's understanding what you're reading, and it's getting to the point where you can enjoy what you're taking in. So that's why it really matters. So what does happen? What does happen to children and young people with dyslexia? Why is it difficult? And I think one of the things that maybe just to say it is learning to read and spell. But when children struggle to read, the consequences accumulate really quite quickly because we are so reliant. And I observed this in my own children when they started school. The amount of text that they were expected to both read, digest, and produce very, very early on in the English school system is vast. So you fall behind very, very quickly if you're not at the expected level. So difficulties accessing written information obviously doesn't just affect English, it affects every single subject. I think there's loads of issues around confidence and motivation, as the previous speaker was talking around, and also engagement with learning. So for many learners with dyslexia, the main challenge is in learning to read rather than understanding what someone's saying to them or their ability. They might find it difficult to identify and manipulate speech sounds, connect sounds to letters, and blend them together to read words. And often it comes along weak processing or weak working memories, which obviously, or slower processing speed can make that really, really demanding. And because so much effort, I see that in children, they devote most of their effort to decoding the word. What is this letter? What does it sound? And what's the mean? Rather than thinking, what does this mean? What is it that I'm trying to understand? So I think it really affects fluency and comprehension and wider learning. So we have a debate in this country around SSP. It's such a long word, systematic synthetic phonics. And I think that's really important. I can obviously see, again, I observed in my own children how incredible it can be and how quickly some children learn from that method, and that's great. Hat off to all the children who can do that, well done. All the teachers who teach it, well done. But I suppose the debate for me isn't really about, is it phonics? It's about versus something else. The question is, what happens if it doesn't work? For those 20% of learners for whom phonics doesn't really work, what do we do then? We know that those learners need, high quality phonics is obviously really important, but you need to have explicit teaching of fluency, comprehension, and language. You need to make sure it's tailored to individual need. If you have slow processing, you might need a different type of intervention or a different type of adaptive teaching than if you have weak working memory, for example. So progress is obviously influenced by more than cognitive skills alone. I think there's quite a lot of stuff, and we come back to, again, confidence, real fear of reading, very early experiences of failure. And I think that's really key. We expect a lot from our children very early on. They are 4 or 5 when we start doing some of this stuff, and their first experience of learning might quite well be a negative one. I am sitting next to my friends and I am not following. They somehow are able to do the things that I can't, even though I'm trying really, really hard, and they seem to just get it without trying. So a truly kind of responsive approach, I suppose, goes beyond those initial phonics and thinks about that child and what that child needs. And I think perhaps we are not so good at that in the UK. We have a phonics alone approach, it feels like sometimes, which we know seems like madness. It's the definition of madness. Don't repeat the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. So understanding dyslexia is only really part of the challenge. The other question is, what happens when the education system doesn't identify you as dyslexic or struggling with literacy, and what support is there? So let's talk a little bit about the scale. 10%, we think. I think it varies a little bit. I've talked to a bunch of people who do various types of screeners. They say somewhere between 8 and 16%. We know about 25% of children, so a quarter, don't pass the initial phonics test at the end of year 1. Most of those children and young people will never be diagnosed. Diagnosis is only available privately. They're not going to get it in school. So they leave without a diagnosis. And there are many reasons why I, as a former teacher, would say, I don't need a diagnosis. I need to look at the child, look at that individual child's needs, and then I provide them with the instruction and the support that they need. But there is something about saying, it's not because I'm not trying, it's not because I'm lazy, and it's not because I'm stupid. It's a challenge I have, and here are ways around that can be really powerful for children. So it's 3 children in every class. They are very overrepresented in the youth justice system, as they are obviously in the adult prison population. So in the adult prison population, we're talking somewhere between 50 to 70% with diagnosed low literacy and dyslexia. So what happens when the support or the identification is not there? And I think I just want to stop here, and I want you to look at that. And I know there's loads of numbers, so I should read them out. 22% of pupils with a specific learning difficulty, most of them are going to be dyslexia, achieve a grade 5 or above in English and maths GCSE, compared to over half of learners without a specific learning difficulty. That is shocking. It is not linked to intelligence. It is not linked to ability. It is just they are functioning in a system which does not identify them, does not support them, and does not make them thrive or succeed. So the attainment gap, I've looked back about 10 years, it is not shifting. It sits there. So all children are doing a little bit better, but the gap hasn't shrunk. The 2 years when the gap did shrink a little bit, and that's COVID, when we had teacher assessments, because teachers are more likely to say, I know this child or young person does know what they're doing, so I'm going to give them this grade. But it's when you're tested, and you're tested on your spelling and your rote learning and your ability to memorize large swathes of information and regurgitate them on a piece of paper, you are not doing so well. So it makes me cross every time I think about this. So I'll move on to another page that makes me cross, because it doesn't just, obviously the impact extends well beyond education. You can see the attainment. It looks the same. It sits in phonics tests, then it goes to SATs, then it goes to GCSEs, and we can then see it in dropout rates in university and other places. So it carries on that challenge. But this is where I got really angry and very sad, because I thought, surely we've moved on. It's 2025 and we published these stats last year. But no, we're not. 6 out of 10 children or young people say they have been bullied or teased because of their dyslexia. 7 in 10 say that it's made them feel really bad about themselves. Nearly everyone's had them assume that they're not clever. And over half say they hide their dyslexia. They don't disclose. And that is reflected for adults. We have thousands of people contacting us on our helpline every year, and they say, shall I disclose in an interview situation that I have dyslexia? And our advice is that's a decision that you have to make, because some people will not take you if you say. So that's just a little bit of what that happens. And I just want to give you some quotes about what do children, young people, and families themselves think about this. So I love this quote. Sometimes this feels very apt. Sometimes my dyslexia makes me really angry. And I think it does. I think most of the young people that we speak to, children and young people, there is a narrative around it being a superpower and all power to the elbow for people who feel home in that narrative. I'm really supportive of that. Just think for lots of children and young people, that is not how it feels. In the classroom when they're being tested. Maybe outside the classroom it feels different, but in the classroom where we test a very narrow set of skills and look for specific types of attainment, just having dyslexia is usually not a superpower. So then we'll come on to, so why does this happen? Why is it like this? There is no mandatory training on dyslexia. And obviously I'd say that it's particularly important when in the early years when children are learning to read, but it does carry on. I was a secondary school teacher and I did every single bad thing you're not meant to do for dyslexic students. Make you read a chunk at a time, and I'm going to go around and it's going to come to you and you're not going to like it. So you're going to kick a chair instead, or fall off your chair, or do something to distract me. So there is no training for teachers. This means that they don't feel like they have the skills, the resources, and that they need to adapt their teaching well. This makes me very cross. Sorry, I'm so cross today. Maybe it's just the heat. At least it's a little bit cooler in here than it was in my loft this morning. Diagnosis is really only available privately. You have to have £700 or more available to you and your family to get to have a diagnosis, which means that you're not identified unless you come from a wealthier background. Local authorities have no clue. We did some studies. 3 out of 152 local authorities in charge of education could tell me how many children they had with dyslexia in their area. If you don't know who they are, and you don't know where they are, how in God's name can you plan and deliver services for them or commission services for them? And many parents feel like they cannot support their child. And I'll just give you, I've been warned that the time is ticking on, so I'll go through quickly. I really want to say this. If teachers and classmates could understand how much effort it takes for me to do something simple like read out loud or write a paragraph, maybe they'd see that I'm not lazy. I'm actually really strong for not giving up. Kudos to all of those young people carrying on. But I just wanted to say a little bit more about who gets diagnosed and who gets supported. So nearly all children in high income households over £100,000 get diagnosed. That drops to 4 in 10 for lower income households. And we just did it under 30. So we could have graded that a little bit more. And I think it would have carried on dropping with income. And that really affects the support that you get. You're more likely to get good quality support and rate it as good quality support if you're from higher income households. Children with English, my time is up. Children with English as an additional language, girls, and if you're in a school in a more deprived area, you're all less likely to get diagnosed. So that highlights major inequality in access to identification and dyslexic support. So here are just a few things that I think would help, and my list is as long as your arm, and I tell the DFE this on a very regular basis, but it's better teacher training, earlier identification, really evidence to inform intervention, not just trotting out the same thing again that we know doesn't work. More assistive technology. So I'm going over my time. I'm just taking it. Then it just very quickly about what we try and do. We try and fix this in many ways. We train professionals, we provide tuition, we do assessments and screening, we do accreditation for professionals. We have a helpline that is free to anyone. It's national. Please do call. And we campaign and we advocate. I'll leave it at that, because these things, there's just loads of free resources on our website. Feel free to use them up. We can send them around. And there's our free helpline as well. So key takeaways, just to finish off. Reading is the gateway to learning. For many learners, success depends on things that are not available, and certainly not available equitably. So support, it's a shocker that support is dependent on your income or where you live or your gender in 2026. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you ever so much. That's another, now we've gone really at a much broader level, and this is good because we've had Manon really focusing on some of the details around bilingualism, for example. And Stephanie similarly, but then also broadening to what about teachers? Yeah, please do take a seat. And if I can invite my colleagues, we will do our best to do 5 minutes each. But as I've been saying, I've been a bit nervous about myself, not about you two, you'll be fine. So just to introduce Rosanne Esposito and Charlotte Hacking. Rosanne is an associate professor teaching here at the IOE at UCL. And Charlotte is the teacher engagement lead here at the IOE, but also part of the centre that's, those in the room can see the banners for the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, that is our centre. So, no, wrong way. I'll just warn perhaps people online that we may need to extend a bit, to allow, if there are questions, we'd obviously quite like to try and address quite a few of them. So I'm going to talk, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we call the Balancing Act Literacy Intervention. This is new work for us. We're all involved, and Emily Rankin, who couldn't be here today, is also involved, and we're building on work in the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy that's gone on for some time, and I've been researching and writing about literacy for probably more than 30 years. I want to come back to Ellen's anger and just back up some of the stats that you had with a slightly different angle, but not much. So what you see here is all of the key stage 2 statutory test scores, but in particular, for example, the number of pupils not reading at the expected standard, which you mentioned was, around about a quarter. But much more, even more worrying for me is those children who don't even achieve the scale score of 80. So they're either at 80 or below. And you can see that year on year, except for 2023, which looks like an anomaly, and I don't understand completely, roughly 4,500 children face some of the most profound difficulties. And as you were saying, I agree that we know, unfortunately, the correlations in later life are for worse outcomes in many ways. So I'm just saying this is the problem, and it's a persistent problem, and it needs new solutions. I mean, the Balancing Act initiative more generally began some years ago, but we've been working recently, we worked together to develop this paper, and this was a mapping of the field of what is effective in terms of teaching and interventions. And it's great that Manon and Stephanie have already said some really important things around what's effective on the basis of robust research and evidence. Now, we took a slightly broader view, and we began at the international level. Why did we do this? Because for good or for bad, politicians often do this. And it's the politicians who determine the systems, and they're the people who could be massively helpful if we had a more evidence-based approach. Briefly, because this work is published and we'll send you the links, but just wanted to say we found 41 systematic reviews. Each one of those reviews started off with hundreds, of hits, and then whittles it down to their selection of robust studies. And these are experimental trials. I will be talking more about qualitative research at another time. What did we find is effective? You need to explicit and actively focus on children's motivation for reading as part of your skills development. That is not generally done. It's seen as separate. I agree that we need flexible, multi-component interventions, not the one silver bullet. And that matters at policy level, at practice level, it matters at all levels. Charlotte will be saying a little bit more about why we think one of the missing ingredients is real text, not only decodables. And we've also argued consistently, and we're not alone, it's great to see Stephanie mention this, we need to teach writing to help reading and vice versa, but that needs thought. We haven't done it before. We've not done it at policy level before. I don't think anywhere, I can't think of any country that the national curriculum systematically shows how you integrate that teaching. That's just a reference to the paper. And so this is the double helix of reading and writing. I was really interested to hear people talking about the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, which we build out of. But our distinct contribution is a theory of teaching, not only a theory of learning. You can see here a few of the core features of our approach that's linked with it. We're in the middle now of evaluating our new approach in all sorts of ways. We have our own small pilot randomized controlled trial, but there's a bigger trial going on, thanks initially to Charlotte, but then Charlotte and I got together and we're interested in the outcomes of that. And I'm pleased to say that our doctoral student is here. And so you're also working away from your perspective, which is great. That's Humaira. And I'm going to hand over to Rosanne.
Thank you. So what we really wanted to do then was to really look at what is actually happening in the classrooms. So moving from, as Don was talking about the international research and the systematic reviews, but we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Like a lot of my background, I was a primary teacher and specialist teacher, but also I deliver the SENCO qualification for UCL and do lots of work with teachers. And one of the things that the teachers are always saying is, what do we do if phonics doesn't work? We're told that it's just phonics. We know what can we do? So we really wanted to get the evidence of what was happening in the classrooms. And one particular quote here that really struck and really kind of emphasised that the anecdotal evidence that we had was really, backed up by the findings in our study. Was a teacher who said, currently there's almost 100% emphasis upon synthetic phonics, when I know from long personal experience it's not effective with every child, and yet the system continues to encourage teachers to continue with phonics. And these are just, as Dom said, we'll send you the link to the paper, but these are just a selection of some of the survey responses. And you can see here that of the 133 responses that we had, 69 of them, that's 52% of the overall sample, said that synthetic phonics is emphasised first and foremost in their approach to the teaching of reading and is taught separately. And when we think about what Don was just saying about this kind of, we know there's so much research that shows the interrelationship between reading and writing, but teachers are consistently encouraged to see those as two completely discrete and not interrelated skills. And only 25 of our sample, 19%, said that phonics teaching is systematically combined in the same lesson with other emphases, including reading comprehension. Going back to some of the earlier speakers talking about the kind of the individual difficulties and the importance of thinking about how we take a more personalised approach. 64 participants, that's just under half of our sample, said that they assess the child's individual difficulties and then create personalised programmes for them. But again, we don't know what the evidence base that they're using in order to do that. And as we know, lots of teachers, 28, there's 21% of the sample, continue with phonics even when phonics has been shown not to be effective for particular children. So we didn't want to leave it there. We had our findings, we had all the findings from the systematic reviews, and we wanted to actually do something practical about that would be of practical help and support for teachers, but would also improve outcomes for the children that Ellen was talking about earlier, who then all the other factors, sort of social and emotional factors that they then experience. So based on the national survey and the systematic reviews and underpinned by the double helix theory, we devised what we've called BALI, the Balancing Act Literacy Intervention, which is an original intervention, evidence-based. It's a manualised 16-week programme for children with reading and writing difficulties. And it also draws on the experience that we have within the team of developing effective language and literacy interventions, and there's a reference there to some work that we've done on that. And just before I hand over to Charlotte, just some of the key features of BALI, and I know it was talked about earlier and Dom just talked about it here, that motivation is central to this, and it threads through everything. If children, we can give them intervention after intervention, but if they're not motivated to engage with the materials that we're using, that really the chances of that making a difference are going to be very much reduced. So we carefully selected real books as a way of approaching that motivation, and check those as well with focus groups of teachers to make sure that they also with this constant sort of co-production engagement with teachers. And the intervention sessions are really rooted in the context of these carefully selected books. So we recognise that phonics is important. We recognise that phonics and spelling need to be taught, but they're really contextualised within rich texts that offer great opportunities for sort of comprehension, vocabulary. And the structure of the programme, including the combination of group sessions and individual sessions, is built on extensive research that shows that the kind of social context of learning is really important, but the individual one-to-one work where teachers can pick up on areas that they've identified of weakness for particular children, there are opportunities for that. Charlotte.
Thank you. I hate to continue with the theme of anger, but I'm going to draw back on Stephanie's anger as well, in that it is really hard, Ellen, sorry, which is really hard to work outside this system of systematic and synthetic phonics at the minute. And as well as working 2.5 days here at the Helen Hamlin Centre, I'm also lucky enough to work 2.5 days in a school where we do have that flexibility to do that contextualised phonics approach. So we are actually a school that is able to live and breathe the double helix in action and see the results of that. So a lot of that is feeding into the work that I've been doing with Rosanne and Dom in developing the BALI programme. Back to Stephanie's, sorry, that was where my brain was going, back to Stephanie's presentation about the real books. And I have to say thank you, Stephanie. I think the Jabari books, you referenced Jabari Jumps and Jabari Tries, might be two of my favourite picture books of all time. That is because real books are really important, because when you get the right book for the right child, mediated by the right adult at the right time, something special and magical happens for a child's engagement and motivation in reading. And real books offer children so much more than some of the dry decodable text that they're reading as part of those synthetic systematic phonic programs. It gives them that rich language. They get exposed to vocabulary, grammatical structures that lift them ahead above of the language they'll receive in their normal everyday conversations. They've got engaging illustrations. It really frustrates me when we get that tell children not to look at the pictures, because actually the best illustrations by the quality of illustrators that we have in the British book publishing world are those illustrations that will make children think beyond the words on the page. Those illustrators are working really hard, not just to tell you what the words say, but to actually increase another layer of meaning beyond the words on the page. The storylines, the themes, the information, the content engages young readers, especially like when Stephanie said, you get books that are representative of children's identities, their backgrounds, but also the things that they are interested in, and funny books as well. They were really important to our children as we were moving through that. So that variety of text types is important as well. We want those texts that give children that language, reading, writing connection, where children have those really purposeful and context-rich opportunities for using and applying the phonic knowledge in context, but also texts that offer those really, really purposeful opportunities and motivation for reading comprehension, for language comprehension, and for writing. So the Bali sessions that we've designed, I'm not going to tell you too much because, as Dom said, we are in the very early stages of a trial of this, and we will share much more later after the trial's finished. But we do have explicit teaching within the sessions. They are, as Stephanie said, fairly scripted. There's a manual that our teaching assistants follow, but they have that explicit teaching of Tier 2 vocabulary, of phonics, but also of morphological patterns and spelling, of common words, of reading fluency, which is so important, the fluency and comprehension being developed alongside that phonics approach. Specific support to come up with ideas for writing. Very often we rush to write this sentence, but where are we showing children how to create and craft ideas? But also those fine-tuned skills of being able to think of a sentence that you're able to write yourself, to compose it, to structure it, to think it, to say it, to write it down. Also how to organise text, and we pick a text selection across different genres, including non-fiction and poetry, so that they can see how different text structures are organised, but also the different language and grammar structures. But also for children to come back to their writing afterwards, to be able to reflect on it, to think, has it done what I want it to do? Could I make it better? And then to go on to edit their writing as well. And we use a range of creative teaching approaches across the sessions that really do help children to develop explicit knowledge and strategies. We look at language, we introduce words, we play with them, we investigate their meaning and context. Reading aloud is really key, hearing that model of fluency being lifted to the level of the book. Echo reading, so you can follow a model of fluency as well. Having that group discussion and interaction so that you can move from that inferential level, from that literal level through to an inferential and evaluative level. Children having chance to draw and illustrate their ideas, to show what they know, to work in role, to step into the shoes of a character, to think how a character thinks, to say what a character might say, and that modelling and sharing of writing as well. So those what the sessions are revolving around, and we're really excited to see what the pilot shows us and to report back more after that.
Thank you guys very much. We're going to now move over here, and we're hoping that if people have questions in the room and online, that we will do our best to see how I better get my water as well, how we can answer them. And I'm hoping that we have a way to enable Manon and Stephanie possibly also to have an opportunity to speak. So Gaston, I believe you are, Ellen, sorry. Come and join us, sorry. Yes, sorry for that. Come and join us. So I think, Charlotte, you can see the online questions, can you? Let's begin with one in the room, though. If anyone, has got an observation or a question that they want to ask straight away, that's fine. And if you would rather ponder a bit longer and hear the conversation emerge, that's also fine. I'm not seeing a hand up yet. Right, excellent. So we have a question for Manon, and I'm assuming Manon will be able to answer. Yeah. So Manon, is there any research on this topic, i.e. bilingualism and word reading teaching, that has been applied to students with SEND or within special schools?
No, is the answer. No. I didn't actually, because of the 15 minutes word limit, time limit, I didn't fully describe the study. The sample that we selected of these bilingual children were the lower end of the class. So if you imagine a typical class in the UK, which is about 30 children, isn't it? It was sort of the 10 children who struggled the most within the classroom, because we wanted to make sure that the intervention that we were doing for application purposes had the biggest impact. So those transfer effects occurred in children who do struggle to read. And so that's very interesting that even then they had some benefit to their second language, albeit not a long lasting one. But when I was researching for that paper and so on, I found very, very few studies looking at this issue in children who struggle with reading.
Yeah, thank you very much, which is why what you're doing is so important, I think. And then we've got a question related to Ellen's presentation particularly. What interventions should UK schools be using? Now that's a big question. Do you want the microphone?
I mean, I don't want the microphone actually, because I'm not sure I know the answer very well. I mean, there are manualized interventions. Of course, there are. I think the EEF is good on manualized interventions, and looking at that. I think when I've looked at this literacy programs that people have, the sort of phonics ones, by the time you get to the intervention arm, stage 3 or whatever they call it sometimes, so catch up, play, all those, they seem to have a lot of the things that you are suggesting in yours, because that's what helps. Explicit teaching, repetition, playing with words in lots of different ways, small group discussions, that all of those things help. And I'm not sure a manualized intervention it's really useful to have, and that has its place. But I think more widely, it's about being able to adapt your teaching to the individual child, and to make sure that your teaching at the beginning is dyslexia friendly, or friendly to sort of children with literacy challenges. I would also say that I feel like there's quite a lot of stuff that we could do to children, with teachers who are teaching children to read in the early years of learning to read, because they are going to be thinking about this a lot. I think it's a really hard challenge in secondary schools, where children are just expected to be able to read, and to provide dyslexia friendly or literacy challenge friendly classrooms in that context. As a geography year 8 teacher, what does that look like? We have a lot less information about effective intervention at that stage, as opposed to, and so that maybe the aim is to have every teacher think of themselves as a teacher who teaches reading rather than a geography teacher 8. That's maybe not a great answer there, but that's actually all I had. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Just a quick response, because one of the things recently that the Calon team and that I've been involved with is a professional development module that is it will help secondary teachers, subject teachers think, I know I'm, say, a maths teacher, but what can I do to help more generally literacy? And in the Wales work we're doing, it's clearly recognised that the problem does not just lie in the early years, because if we just wait, and then it'll be too late, won't it? So it's another really interesting feature, I think, of what's going on in Wales. And I'm lucky to be on the Welsh Government literacy expert panel with Manon and a group of people, really good group of people. Anyway, I'm also grateful to I've realised that people in the room, of course, you'll be able to talk to us as long as you like. So, which is nice. So I'm grateful to the people online, because they've managed to find questions for all of us, which is not all. It's really very nice of them. So we get a question. Someone says, I read there's no research suggesting that decodable readers are beneficial. Are you aware of any research into their use? Right. Well, I'm going to kick off, and then if you want to cut. So first of all, I think we need to say that, to be honest, most of the studies that show that systematic synthetic phonics, not necessarily only synthetic phonics, I should point out, systematic phonics teaching, most of those studies, to my knowledge, have been done with decodable readers. There are, I'm also thinking it may have been Stephanie herself or someone else. There was a meta-analysis trying to look at, or a systematic review trying to look at, can you determine if using real books is better than using decodables in relation to skills? As I recall, it was sort of surprise, surprise, well, you get different things from them. And I think that's our view, isn't it? That I think we see a benefit, but at the moment in some countries, and I would count England as one, the pendulum has moved too far one way. I don't know if you guys want to say anything else either on that, Mike, or this one.
I'm going to talk from a practicing teacher's perspective here. It's part of that, looking at the whole child and seeing what that whole child needs. Decodable readers can offer something for that child who does need to practice that specific skill. And I hope I'm not talking out of turn here, but what we need to remember is that a lot of the programs that are being pushed in this country are commercial programs. They will look to tie you into buying more and more and more of those books. So what the teacher has to do is look at who are those texts beneficial for, when are they beneficial, and for how long, and when are they ready to move on to something different.
Yeah, and just to add that also, building on that is what that particular child needs, but it's also recognizing what the limitations of those decodable books are, and thinking about what Stephanie was saying about, kind of the social emotional side of it and the diversity, and how, then linking that to motivation. If you keep getting more of what you've always been getting and it didn't do it the first time and it didn't do it the second time, then there is, good reason to expect perhaps it needs something else. And for children to identify with a text and to be able to see themselves in it is really important as well. And I think it's recognising where the limitations may be and what else might be needed.
And also that they should never be used in isolation. Yeah, they might be used as part of a child's reading experience, but alongside that, they should still be read aloud to, read to, which is where all the important work that Stephanie did with younger readers down the school, those are the foundations for literacy.
But I suspect I think it's fair to say we think, nor is it satisfactory to say you're going to have decodable readers for, say, an hour a day, 3/4 of an hour, half an hour a day. But it's fine because you've got all that rich literacy in the rest of the time. But our point is it needs to be contextualized and connected up. I am conscious of everybody here is hot and everybody presumably online. Not everybody, because I know there are people in different countries where it may be cooler. So I'm going to suggest, if that's all right, I address this one more question now, and I apologize for the people who've got further questions, but if they send them in, I'm sure we can address them. Because this one is international. Thank you so much for the insightful session, and thank you for the comment. I was wondering how the Bali model will look like in an English as a second language context, as I kept thinking about students in South Asia, where literacy, especially phonics, is taught in a rote manner. I do understand the research is being done in the UK. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the future of this in the context I mentioned. Well, as it happens, I've just submitted a paper with 2 colleagues where we are comparing Singapore with Victoria in Australia and England, admittedly at a kind of mainly at policy level, but crucially, we're also looking at what are the different evidence bases that are being drawn in those different regions. And it's quite astonishing, the differences, actually, yet they all say they're addressing the same issue. So that's for the future if once it finally gets published. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. I just want to add to that one in the sense, I've just come back from doing some SEND training for teachers in Hong Kong, from teachers across different parts of Asia. And I think one of the other things that we're really interested in, obviously we've got to start somewhere. We're starting this in England and in relation to the English curriculum and the English context. But one of the things that we're really interested in doing is then working with teachers in other countries, in other geographical contexts, to look at how that can be adapted to make sure that it can meet the needs, both the professional development needs, but also the kind of the needs that children who have English as a second language have. So that's for further down the line.
Excellent, thank you. I just want to finish with, first of all, thank you ever so much, everyone in the room, online. Really appreciate. Yes, clap to you all. I'm going to drop this pebble in the water and run away. It's the final question. How much responsibility for our provision should Ofsted, that's the inspectorate, be taking in England? Many teachers are afraid of trying anything other than SSP. That word "afraid" should never be necessary to be used in a professional system. I leave you that. Thank you all. Goodbye to some of you, and hello to others.